Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment from the 2MK team. As promised, we worked out MerkavaBot and with fortune, running through everyone, finding they were all kind of okay, but not great. We have come up with some interesting outcomes. Specifically, that Phonon also works quite well, as you're about to see, and that almost all of the characters with down-down moves and good running B or 6-6B can be used with this input. In fact, it's a good way to get started if you don't know how to play the game as a whole, and I kind of wish that we'd gotten this one from the beginning. But in that sense, it's going to be kind of like a flashback. However, since we're this far in, we will in fact go into looking first at the specific bots and take some looks at other things later. So the stream should follow its usual flow of some explanation without direct point systems necessarily, some explanation of the inputs needed. One of them has a variant, but the variant is very concise and simple enough to do, though there are some difficult parts in terms of how you need to input certain things and how lenient you can be about them. You are of course already watching things on screen of Mika versus Merkava. And as you'd expect, Merkava and Phonon are mostly about keeping yourself from getting kept out too much and from being out of position or space to do things you need to do. They are, however, characters with reasonably good overheads and a tricky air game in the sense that if they go into the air just straight up, it doesn't necessarily telegraph anything. The way normal characters are in most games, going straight up into the air is a tell that you can advance or that they're coming to you and you should anti-air. Neither Phonon nor Merkava actually has this property. If they go into the air, it might mean they're coming at you, it might not, and if you try to advance, you have a reasonably high chance of getting hit. Again, for all, as usual, we will always give a parallel to Street Fighter for those who have started bots from that side with us. You should be able to think of these characters mostly as equivalents of Falk and Dalsim, even though they are not really like those characters at all. This is a very much more fabulous game. But you can at least think of it in terms of how you will need to approach certain aspects of it to match that. Merkava is primarily about blocking his overhead. The interesting thing here is that he does have a different overhead that we wanted to work in. It's the same animation as the 3C you're seeing. His 6C does this as well. It is actually also faster, but the main thing is to recognize that move and block it. He has some other stuff that the bot could have, some fake outs. You can actually relatively easily tweak it if you understand stuff about the character to get what you need. But overall, he has similar moves all the time. He just uses slightly different animations for a lot of them. The reactions you need to have to certain visual things, though, are about the same. The only thing we did not give him was one specific 4C overhead, and we didn't bother to give him most of his really long-range C buttons, even though you can fit those in if you really want as well. So, as it is set up now, this is the version of it that we know with some certainty will not have a problem when used for other bots. Just randomly pick other characters, and something decent should come out. If you're unfamiliar with the game, if we haven't come up with a bot yet, even our tricky Carmine has a slight variation to one of these, which is currently the one we have in, so we will be able to show you fairly easily. Even Carmine has that slight variation where it's like, oh, he looks functional now, that's great. Similarly, Phonon will be mostly about similar things. Her overhead is different. It's less of a this will happen in different ways and at different times, and more of a this move is just weird. She has follow-ups that cause more problems, and just some basic moves that are hard to punish because she's so good at controlling space. Merkava is very similar in that, but a Merkava player at the beginning may be a bit more likely to make mistakes. We are, after all, primarily attempting to teach you how to deal with players who are now getting used to the game and at a certain level of play where they're a bit more likely to, let's say, spam, quote-unquote, certain things, or at least focus on getting in on you to get their stuff going, rather than trying to play super patient or bait you into things or whatever else. So obviously, like that, the bot will just keep on doing a ton of things and it will be fine. The main difference, therefore, between the two is just coming down to that. With Merkava, you are looking for him to keep attacking you from his preferred range, and you either punishing it or moving into position to deal with him before he can do it. Most of the time, he will stop you. If he flies into the air, you can get him certain ways, but your general goal is make sure that you understand where Merkava is and his options from that position to decide if to move. The answer is almost always no. And to decide how to push on him. If you read up on the page, it actually describes him basically as that. He's so good at controlling space and making the opponent scared of hitting buttons that he gets to make his approaches. Now, obviously at higher levels you would want to stop him from doing the approaches at all, but here you can start to get used to it, and since you're just getting used to the game in general, we'll see later on that if you're a mashy-er player, you will actually manage to knock him out of some stuff and not other stuff, and learning which is going to end up being important. This bot has 2 or 3 ways that they can turn out based on your input skill, and while he's not super hard, there are definitely things that shift. He is, however, set up such that most of the time, even if he does not get everything that is possible from the input, he's still decent for training against, and you can build up your skills at inputting the bot, or just like realize, this seems a little too easy, let me try this one input a bit more to see if I can get something. Or if you don't have time that day for all of that, then put in and go with more or less whatever you've got, and you should still have something helpful. In terms of dealing with your understanding of Vorpal, he is mostly good at holding on to Vorpal. He's not super good at building it up if you are attacking him, so if you get an advantage he tends to lose. But if he can hold his space to prevent you from getting anything, he often has at least a chance of winning Vorpal. He also has a lot of moves that keep you in animations for a long time, which helps you to learn to watch it. But of the 2 bots, he's technically the harder one to look at. So let's switch to Phonon and take a look at her, since she's also going to end up being the one easier to demonstrate certain parts of the inputs on. Merkava has a bit too many things that look similar and can't necessarily be told apart in a simpler way. Phonon is, once again, good at controlling space herself. She's not as good at holding Vorpal, partially because she tends to use her force function more, and because of the way she moves around on the screen, meaning that unless she's actively trying to hit you, she doesn't tend to keep it up. If she is properly actively trying to hit you, she can hold it for quite a while, and this makes her much more dangerous than when Merkava does. She's also at least intimidating in a different way, meaning that you could spam things, but Merkava tends to get beaten by complete mashy spam of invincible moves and similar, whereas Phonon often gets out of the way. This might result in her still losing Vorpal, but at least you could realize, oh, I'm getting hit, and I'm definitely getting hit. And as you know, normally we suggest that you have your health recovery off. We will not be doing that for the first part of this stream because that's how we demo these things. But she's definitely not an easy character to just disregard her movement. and she will come forward at you, as that is part of how her overhead functions. In order to stop certain things that these characters do, you are going to have to shield. But it's shielding something very easy to see coming and relatively easy to understand. It's a sort of binary thing where if you shield correctly, you can immediately see a change, and therefore it will help you learn when you've done it right and how to feel about it. Specifically, the move you see her continually use here, that running sort of flip kick, it is best to shield this move as it changes whether or not she can do certain follow-ups from it. Similarly, if you shield it correctly, or at least better, let's say, different things happen. She also has one of the easier to punish style moves in the game. Basically, her 3C, which is something you shouldn't be too far away from. If you are reasonably far away, you will probably be in problems because it's only -14 and it is basically a full screen low. However, if you are close when she does it or happen to jump with the expectation and she happens to do it as a way of keeping out but you blocked, even at mid-screen, if you're familiar enough with frame data, this is a -14 move, and if you were really expecting it, then you could shield that too and make it even more advantageous for yourself and let you get off some quick counterattacks if you are in range. This is a good way to learn the range of your longest normals and what combos you can get from them at the max range in question. So as you can guess, the point systems are going to be somewhat related to that. Therefore, let's now go into the specifics of the inputs. The inputs for this bot are relatively easy, more so because they can be understood when you look at them than because they're specifically easier to input. The action 1 is a 4A, 4B, slide to 3, i.e. 4, 1, 2, 3, end, and you must end quickly or this will not work as well. We again suggest recording this on Merkava. It's a little bit finicky feeling on Phonon because of the differences in the animation timings of their moves. Phonon will most likely give you the feeling that you had longer to slide down to down forward to 3 than you technically should have taken. And it's a little bit hard because, as you can see here, she does, if you block it, do a third hit. But that third hit is actually because she's hitting A again, or because the timing has looped all the way around so that a different button has been hit, B is hit again, those sorts of things. It's very important to try to get this timing that way, which means that this input is quite quick. As always, just hold the button for the 4A at the beginning and move from there. We were mentioning that this bot is a good semi-starter. It does a lot of things for a lot of characters, these set of inputs. Basically, the initial bot, the Wagner type bot, works for characters who have a good 2C, not punishable, chains into good things, usually there's 5C, and lets you control space that way. When the character does not have a great 2C, or at least is not so good in combos and it ends up being unsafe and they don't necessarily want to mess with it, then this works fairly well for them. So some characters don't do well with it, and the characters that do not do well with this are those who have generally force functions that stop their movement, and do particularly those who have force functions that stop their movement and don't attack you, and those that have specific requirements for how their 2C works in order for it to be safe enough to make sense to do it, in other words. We'll get back to that later as well, but just a general primer for those who are not necessarily watching too much further, that's why it works. Moving on to action 2. Action 2 is a somewhat harder input. This is 6a plus b, which should cause a dash, into a half circle back, i.e. 6, 3, 2, 1, 4. But you are going all the way to 7 to back jump at the last moment, and you're trying to end that recording literally as soon as you can. You really want, optimally, that this is done so fast that she never leaves the ground. She's basically still recovering in the dash animation. In Merkava's case, this is much easier to make sure of because his dash animation is a little different. So once again, we suggest record on Merkava. But once you've achieved this, you do want to be able to see the replay come back with a back jump. And that back jump will often go into either a forward like that or a swing of various timings. The hard part of this input is doing it that quickly after the relatively strange way that UNIST starts recordings, but you do need it to be done that way. You can't tap, otherwise you will lose some of the moves that the character needs to be able to do. So, fortunately, if this doesn't turn out too well, most days it won't ruin either of these bots. It may have strange effects on some others, because it tends to result in them lacking their quarter circle back moves and tending to spend a bit too much time in the air. But most of the time, for these two, if you didn't have a really great outcome that day and don't have time to make that perfect, you can usually manage with just this without worrying that it's going to ruin everything. Moving on, therefore, to Action 3. Action 3 is relatively simple. Once again, you generally want to record it on Merkava, as it's hard to see what Phonon does with it at all. She actually is supposed to be doing her 3C as the start, and then she does up, up, down, down very quickly. When you record this on Merkava, you actually want the 3C to whiff or at least be really far away so that you, as the player, don't expect it to hit. Now, this is interesting because if you are slower with it, he will cancel 3C into fly, which is functionally good and therefore not a big deal. It also doesn't affect Phonon that badly, so you don't really care that much if it does work out that way. The problem with this is more so that if you do this, you must delay the down down a bit. Rather than just going up up down down as quickly as you can, if you find that you tend to do this move in such a way that he cancels into fly, you would want to delay the down down in order to make sure he's able to put down his snakes, leeches, whatever you want to call them, that you saw earlier, and to make sure that Phonon is able to do that move. Basically whipping the ground, and so on. Without this, the down-down moves of most characters will not be available, which changes quite heavily whether or not the bot is functional if you are aiming to use a character that actually has those types of moves. However, you could be on a day where none of that matters to you, and this input could be changed to anything you wanted. It's also not that hard to do, so it can be useful at times to just replace this with whatever you think is most useful for the character, and this is why it has this slot in the inputs as we've mentioned before. You can just put it in here. The 3C, however, is super important because unless you want the character to be doing their uppercut a lot of the time, such as in the Wagner bot, in which case you could just replace this completely, but they have an uppercut style move and you want them to do it occasionally, this is sometimes relevant to that input, especially if you want the EX version of the move. This will not always work if Action 2 was slower, because the way that this works is a really fast shortcut behavior with going from forward all the way back and then instantly going to 3C. under certain specific circumstances, and that is the only thing that will cause the uppercut, the DP style motion to actually work. There seems to be some other situations where you can get this to happen if you were moving from, let's say, 1 into 2 at certain timings, etc. But all of those seem to be shortcuts, and therefore we're not really going to say this will work. So make sure that it is 3C you start with, unless you really don't like the 3C of a character for whatever reason, or had some reason to change the entire input. But if there is one you are going to change just because you're switching character and you want a different thing from them, this is the one to be changing. This up, up, down, down input is interesting on Phonon when used in conjunction with everything else, and important to Merkava, but not really for any other characters. So you can ditch it if you want to. Action 4 is also relatively simple, but it is also very variable. Action 4 would have been the sort of thing I would have put in Action 5 prior, but it's more so that it cannot change what the plan is, it just changes certain very small specifics of it. For Merkava and Phonon, this input is 6B plus C, 6A plus D, which is hidden in the B plus C force function, and end. It can also be 4B plus C if you want more of their quarter circle back moves. But again, this depends a lot on how you managed Action 2. It's not really that relevant. You don't need it to be there in order to get good stuff. However, 6B plus C does help Phonon have more projectiles and certain specific timings for things in her rhythm. Using A plus D is useful, but in this particular thing you're looking at now is basically just D. Whether or not you want the opponent to move forward or not is the most important thing. But we will come back to the Action 4. For now, that's all you really need to understand about it. It is 6A plus D, but you don't always have to have A plus D. It mostly depends on whether or not the character you want to work with has a good situation, a good throw setup, or not. Carmine, for example, will use it, and Merkava and Phonon don't really need it, and characters who spend a lot of time assaulting in are often better off without it and just use 6D. Finally, Action 5 is simple, but a little bit hard to input on the correct timing, actually. Action 5 is 6-6B. You need to hold the B, because holding the B is what gives Phonon this specifically stronger version of this running, swinging overhead. And then hold 1 to block for a little bit, and end. This is useful because it causes the bot to block at some really well set up times. Specifically because if you hold it with that timing, the overlap of most moves will take up the entire timing for that 6-6B and exit the animation of a move prior to this one. Let's say that she threw a fireball due to Action 1 playing into basically anything else. While that fireball is animating, Action 5 will be playing. 6-6B will not happen, but if you attempt to punish it, the 1 at the end to block will. The important thing, therefore, is to just block long enough that this block is meaningful, even if the player puts out a certain type of move, a relatively slower move. So this action tends to, as far as we can tell, need to reach at least 60 frames long, even though it could be recorded much slower. Well, much smaller. It is therefore not a big deal if it doesn't block that much if you are the type of player that already naturally knows to respect certain things other characters do. The move is punishable enough that if you are good at it and on any given day you input it without too much blocking, you probably know you were able to make the punish anyway and you're not confused as to whether or not you were fast enough. This does affect a lot of the other bots because of the timings for their blocking, and the additional time at the one input also helps to slow down things so that you tend to get more time with the 4A clips and so on, without it having the potential to turn into a move you didn't want. Giving it not quite footsies, but a little bit of benefit if the spacing of one of the bot's moves turned out to be particularly good for its purposes. Therefore, with those inputs, we will take a look at some of the characters that it works well for, and some of the characters it works terribly for. But in order to demonstrate that, we will have a switch in to Nanase, as Mika, while she is phenomenal at defending, doesn't tend to do a lot of moves she can get hit out of, on account of the giant gauntlet arms. We will not yet be changing the actual health recovery, because again, we're just going through some bots that this works for and some that it doesn't. Let's start with Eltnum, who is quite interesting in that she looks kind of functional, but probably needs more work, and we will not consider this an Eltnum bot. We really only consider this to be a bot for Merkava and Phonon, and this part is more so about which ones we think are worth your time if you're not familiar with the game, to pick up a little bit of experience with using this input set. Either because no bots exist for them yet, or their bots are complicated to input, or you just want to poke at them for that day. Eltnum will at least shoot. She will also do certain things in the air with some regularity and be effective-ish. She works better when there is no throw. When action 4 is 6B plus C, 6D. She doesn't really care too much about the rest of it, you just try to get them as good as possible. She's not terrifying, she's just, oh look, here's a couple of Eltnum things that Eltnum is doing. If you block correctly and are used to the character, you can learn to punish a couple of things that your opponent does. She will have a variable enough range that you will occasionally get a chance to see some of them. And depending on which of the ways the input flowed, you should generally be fine. She also works slightly better with 4B plus C, mostly because it changes whether or not she does certain uppercut style moves. So technically she is really functional on that variation of action 4. 4B plus C, 6D, and end. We won't be showing that off just yet, possibly not at all, but it might occur later in the stream if we have the time. Overall though, she is barely functional enough in this form, and you might get to see later, but I can just promise you that she's bearable in the other. You will learn a little about Eltnum using it if you don't know much about her before now. As mentioned, this is for Carmine, so let's look at him quickly. For Carmine, this is the exact input. The 6B plus C matters because of what his force function does and the way it is executed. The 6AD matters because he gets health back when he does his throw. And him having more quarter circle forward stuff is really nice. He does not have a great running B, or 6-6B, but it's not so terrible that you generally have a problem, and he spends a lot of time doing moves, especially if you manage to do the dash part, 6-6B, really quickly. Sometimes it will prevent him from like doing it too late or spamming it too much. Or he'll do it in cases or situations where you are not expecting it and you want to hit him before he gets a chance to hit you. He'll often be at a good spacing as well. So while it is not the easiest thing to deal with, it isn't really all that dangerous for him to do, and you do get to see some Carmine stuff happening here. We do not have a point system for this, even though it wouldn't be that hard to come up with one. We might be able to release Carmine along with things and just count this as PhononBot 1, and then come up with a better one later for those who are interested in it. But we cannot guarantee this, so we will see what happens over the weekend. We will not be getting any point system for this during this stream. Continuing along though, let's just run through quickly. I will talk about the ones that are not useful at all and not play them, and we'll just go across the cast and skip. Starting from Carmine, going one to the right in this case. Our next character is generally not that useful. Aurea does much better on the original bot. We will not be bothering to do that here. She tends to stick a bit too much to just doing nonsensical things and bouncing around in the air in a way that is not as helpful as it previously was. Interestingly, this is one of the more useful ways to play Aurea, but in a sense, the problem here is that a player who plays like this is often too good and has too good a concept of spacing. So it's hard to say. The bot isn't so much useful for teaching you to fight it, but it might be a little useful for helping you understand what it might look like, especially if you don't try to go in on her. She will generally be spaced fairly well if you are not trying to go in. You can just use that as a general thing, but this is not worth a bot, and it is not really something that can have a meaningful point system. Therefore, we move on. One more to the right. Brings us to Gordeau, who already has his own stuff, more or less. The fact that there is a 3C in here is useful. He's okay. But because he does not have his 6B and only has his dashing B, he doesn't have his overhead, and he spends a lot more time doing his down-down moves into buttons that cause him to go spiraling into the air, as opposed to PhononBot itself, which specifically is tailored so that it only does 2-2A. Therefore, our verdict on Gordeau in this is you might as well have entered PhononBot, and even if you were not able to enter PhononBot and thought it was too difficult to do, which is reasonable because it's fairly hard, this will teach you a little bit about the character, but it will not teach you a lot. You will still need PhononBot eventually, and I doubt that too many players are going to be playing like this. So if we had to grade this, it's like a D. Not really worth your time unless you have a lot of trouble inputting PhononBot or feel as if you just need to get used to him in the game. In the next slot is Merkava himself. Obviously, we will not be going back to that right away, so we go on to Batista, who is, as you'd expect, completely useless. Batista has nearly no meaningful usability in this bot that would not have been much better in her own. Even if you had trouble inputting Batista bot, it would probably be better than this. Interestingly, because a lot of the stuff is similar enough to that you really might as well just try to enter Batista bot. If you don't understand charge timings or similar, I guess it could do a little bit to get used to this, but it won't really get you used to the character at all. It will barely show you a few of her moves. So she gets an F rating, complete failure, No use whatsoever. Seth is next in line, and Seth is a character where, as mentioned, his force function stops his motion, and his 2-2 button has a purpose sorta, but not an actual one in most flows. He is very pressury in this form. He pokes a lot of buttons, but technically Seth works better when he doesn't do that way. The original bot works well because of Seth's really good 2C and the fact that it lets him do certain things from it. So this could get you used to the bot as a general thing, but it's not so much easier to input in the first place that it even helped, and Seth's 3C is really not something you care about. Overall, therefore, it's not terrible. You could still get a little something. He moves around in the air well, he uses the fast fall, he throws out orb, just enough that you could get something in terms of minor understanding of this. But perhaps in my arrogance, I don't believe any Seth will play like this, even if they are not used to the game yet. Most likely you'll get a bit more of a cohesive play style and a lot more to understand. Meaning that if you can manage to put in the Wagner type bot, even with flaws, it's probably better than this. We will rate Seth in this form an E. Moving on, once again, to the next character, Yuzuriha. Yuzu needs forward stuff, whereas this tends to give back stuff. She also isn't really a character that benefits super heavily from being in the air, or from short taps of the force function. But in this form of it, where she is using the 6B plus C as action 4, it's okay. It can definitely be worse if you happen to input the 4A plus B for some reason. 4B plus C for some reason. It's meaningfully worse. However, since she is kind of a different character than most people are used to, if you haven't managed to input the bot or understood that much about her before now, and just want to try it out with putting her to be the one you're using with this bot, you might get a little bit of understanding of the character. It's unlikely to help you understand how to fight her, but punishes and certain types of movement can probably be picked up on. So in this particular form, I'll give her a D+, maybe a C on a particularly good day, because hers matter a lot more in terms of how well you happen to do the inputs. So yes, let's go with C on a good day. Worth your time, but not by much. And since a bot already exists for her, you're better off trying to put that in and only using this if you really find it's too complicated to do. And that's unlikely because they're very similar, honestly. Next in line, therefore, is Hilda. Hilda is surprisingly functional in this form, particularly with, again, the 6B plus C version of Action 4. She's also one that works fairly well if you ended up going relatively high into the air on Action 2. And you get to see a lot more keep out stuff. So, honestly, I'm going to rate Hilda fairly high here. This is not necessarily bot level, as it teaches you nearly nothing. But in terms of just understanding the character, maybe getting used to a couple of things she does, especially on good input days when she can do more teleporty uppercut things, you can definitely get something out of this. Particularly because the 3C helps her do the dive kick thing, which is naturally present in the other form. She kind of spams the B plus C, which does stop her momentum, but it also helps with an anti-airs It's not really a great move though, and often results in her losing a lot of Vorpal, so it's not really good for teaching you how to handle her as a character. She lacks a lot of the really required keep out game in this form. But again, we're talking more so about functionality. Can you learn things about the character as a generality from this? Yes. Particularly when she happens to get enough of speed on the input to get more of an uppercut sort of thing going, or if you really need to learn to handle when Hilda is trying to get in on you. She does not get her 2B though. Honestly, she doesn't get it in the Hilda bot either, so it's not really that big a deal. But the specific concept of where on the screen she would want to use it is not in this bot, which is what makes it important. Hilda bot is built around making you stay out of the range where 2B would have poked at you. Whereas this one does not encourage that at all. In fact, it kind of encourages you to stand exactly there, which you absolutely should not do. So, in terms of understanding how to punish Hilda, how she will move in general, just some, oh, this is how you hit this character and which combos I can manage to do because she tends to be in the air or whatever. You can definitely learn quite a lot. I will rate this as a B, B+, and worth your time if you are not familiar with her. Even to the point of maybe inputting it just to get to poke at her if the Gordo bot, which is her other actual form, is difficult or time-consuming on that day. We have already done Eltnam, so we will move on further. Wait, no, that's not next. Is it? No, Chaos should be next. Right. Chaos is confusing. He seems to be very dependent on how well you did the inputs that day. But because his dash B is also not that great, it is a launcher, but it's also relatively easy to see coming, and doesn't actually move all that far. He spends a lot of time moving Ajidahaka around, whereas in the other form, it's a lot more useful to get things. And he gets more defensive sorts of things and mix-ups, pin-downs, stuff that make you actually worry about Aji's location a lot more than this often does. Still, he is not terrible, and you do tend to get cross-up style attacks fairly often. The main problem being that they're usually way more telegraphed, and he's not usually close enough to you to make you worry about it. He is good at making Aji disappear and flustering you mentally, so once again, he may kind of be useful to learn how to start off if you could not enter the Wagner bot for any reason, but can manage this one. Just getting used to watching the character, seeing the things he can do, the things that happen. But he's not really teaching you a lot about punishes. So, mostly optics. Therefore, I don't know whether or not to rate him C or D, but I know that I personally would not suggest trying to input this bot in order to get any chaos practice. He will sometimes do more things than you're seeing in this version, but it's not really helpful. Moving on, therefore. From here on, most of the characters that are available are useful. It may get a little confusing, but as always you should remember that the green Nanase is the bot. This one is particularly useful once again with mostly the D only option, as it will cause her to do better assault jump in stuff, and her dash B is quite good because it is a low. Combined with assault into jump C and similar, you will get some overheads, and her combos and cancels are not that bad. Her rhythm is also such that you end up getting a lot of cancels and flip arounds, as well as occasionally she will use the uppercut, She will fly relatively well. The problem is that this is not a cohesive bot. Once again, she's too mobile. She doesn't have anything that even approximates to a mix-up most of the time. And she does not have the TK Gust, Air Bullet, whatever you wish to call it, that you can actually learn from that is one of the staples of Nanase's actual play. However, once again, if you just feel like practicing against Nanase and could not manage to enter the Gordo bot, this is okay. You will learn at least some things. Especially some punishes that the other one wouldn't actually put into your quick muscle memory as much. Similarly, you might learn to time anti-airs on people who are not as creative with her movement. You can probably mostly keep the sort of things that require you to understand Nanase out of your mindset when it comes to playing this, though. I don't really feel as if understanding that is going to do anything. So overall, I'll give her a C. You might want to put it in if you can't do the Gordo bot. And you will get something out of it. And hopefully something that will help you become more able to do things against the Gordo bot version once you've practiced a little bit. Still useful enough. Therefore, once again, onward. Unfortunately, I could probably have skipped him, because Byakuya is by far the worst incarnation of this bot. Byakuya bot himself is many, 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 many times better. And this just doesn't have any cohesiveness to it under most inputs, basically at all. It does help you get used to punishing his slide, I guess, maybe shielding it, but this isn't a great move for most people to use, and the bot tends to not use it at really well set up ranges because of the rhythm, so we can just move on immediately. I'll give it an F, and if you really want to see some moves that the other does not use, then go for it, but this is mostly terrible. Phonon is obviously herself. We will come back to her later when we are discussing point systems. And Mika is... I want to say she is functional, but we were really hoping to do a lot better things with our Mika bot. She has some definite movement abilities that are interesting, but her 3C gets spammed far too much because probably it has a long animation, and unlike other characters of this bot where the 3C is a really integral part of the play that changes a lot of the matchup, hers is just kind of a random poke that does nothing. She might be more functional if you change just the one input, and we'll see what we get from there. But for now, you should assume that until you see some note from us about it, she is inconclusive in that you can put her in exactly like this, then change action 3 to whatever you think might actually work, as long as it's fairly fast, and you might get something good. The main problem here being that the 3C doesn't work well for this purpose. You might want to try 3B, but let us know if you come up with anything, and we will try to integrate it into our MerkavaBot upcoming, which is probably not next week, just so that we can have more research on it in this form. But we definitely have more plans for this character and a person who plays this character enough that we can probably come up with something, even if we end up using this as the base. So we can move on once again. Wagner obviously has her own bot, but honestly she's not terrible here. She does have her shield and sword charges still. She also uses her force function decently. The main problem with the Wagner version of this bot is that it moves forward far too much, unlike Wagner bot, which is often about moving backward. And while it does not necessarily overuse the force function, her dash B is not really that good. Or it has a similar problem to the 3C from Byakuya. She tends not to do it at the spacing you'd actually care about. Since she is a footsie character that does a lot of space control with her normals, and this bot really doesn't tend to just hit normals, you'd have to modify it once again in order to get something useful, and at that point you might as well just use the other version because you are worrying about things like when she does the uppercut timings and so on. But she does still have definitely enough stuff in here to be good at making you punish Stormbreaker and deal with other aspects of her moves. It's just that she will get too close to you far too often, and if you change that, your problem will obviously be that you then won't really be able to use any other bots. Perhaps there is some possibility to make a combination of the Wagner bot inputs and these inputs to get something interesting or unique, especially if you have trouble with particular Wagner bot inputs. Just replace them with whatever you have from this one and see what you get. Might still come up with something really good there. But they tend to be similar but easier, and the result is as you'd expect. Similar but worse. If you do find it interesting though, you can still definitely learn some Wagner stuff from it, as well as some stuff that the Wagner bot itself doesn't do, mostly because it only is really effective against certain characters. But if you know that you play one of those characters through either research or just fighting a Wagner who drives you crazy, then you should probably be able to test this out, see if it feels familiar, and can therefore be used to help you with your practice. Therefore, I will rate this a C only because we know that it can be better. Moving on once again, therefore, Enkidu is still not a character that strictly makes sense as a bot. However, interestingly, this is among the better forms of him. Most of the time, him using certain moves and then cancelling into or using his counter doesn't make any sense in terms of the flow. Depending on how you do this, he does, however, use his counter well. He seems to benefit more from the 4B+C version of Action 4, but still works decently even in this form. So he, like Eltnum, we may come back to show off the little differences later on in the stream, after we've gone through the main point systems and have a little time to kill to show off some other cool stuff you can do. So for now, we won't pay too much attention to Enkidu, just as we did not pay too much attention to Eltnum. If we have time at the end of the stream, they will get some visuals. Next, after Eltnum herself, therefore, is Akatsuki. Akatsuki kind of suffers here. In the 6B+C version, he still at least throws out the projectile well enough to be meaningful, and his jump straight up has some stuff that comes out of it, as well as good use of his down-down, and he blocks really well. If anything, that's probably your best benefit from this character. He blocks well, his force function stops him, but doesn't mean you can hit him, and his invincible uppercut style move tends to give you a lot of stress. So you can think of him as a way to learn to be patient, sort of, as he moves around quite a lot, but he moves, let's say, with purpose. Very mobile characters are not likely to have too much problems with him, but they will often find that he blocks a lot of things. If you can start your attacks from really far away, then he's probably not going to be a big problem for you. If you, however, often have to use your high mobility, which is generally not threatening, to get close to him, and then from there you feel, okay, time to get started, this might actually be useful to you. The main issue is that the up, up, down, down input in this case will generally cause his neutral jump to have at least a chance of coming straight back down on your head, which is telegraphed, let's say. It's relatively easy to recognize that this is happening and why it's happening, and therefore just learn all his rhythms. But it's not really something that, as far as we're aware, you would see mostly from actual players, so it's hard to judge whether or not this is really good. He does work a little bit better when you have the A plus D in the input so that he is throwing you occasionally, but it depends on the character. Maybe sometimes you do really just want that grounded assault from him. So far we found that as a no. His zoning is less zoning and more I'm going to throw the fireball occasionally. And therefore the final rating I will give this is also a C. If you are the sort of person that likes to just go ham, especially if you got the last blocking part of Action 5, if you're very offensive, trying to constantly get in on the opponent to get started, Orie character, Death, to some extent maybe Hide, then you might get something out of this. But everyone else is mostly just fodder for, he's just fodder for hitting him with your long range moves, and it doesn't really result in there being any actual threat to you. Meaning that we will rotate around to Hide on that point. Once again, in the version where the 6 B plus C is what you have used, Hide is okay. I would honestly go so far as to say he's a little bit better than okay, but nowhere near the effectiveness of either of the Hide bots. He's similar to Akatsuki where he does things, but mostly ends up being with punish fodder for your own longer moves, or gets clipped by your long specials without really defending himself all that well. Depending on your inputs, he also spams a certain amount of things, and since he's not holding the B plus C or anything similar in this input, he's just more or less sticking out buttons. Decent at avoiding, will occasionally do like his ground spike stuff, but overall, I'll have to give it a D. There are better and easier things you can do to get a meaningful Hide bot. However, it's similar to before in that he's like Wagner. If you can't get all of the inputs for the Wagner bot and you mix and match them, you may find that that mix and match hybrid Chimera Wagner bot form will also work for your Hide bot. Unlike Seth, which we don't expect it to even start working for. This is primarily because, like Wagner, he tends to have longish buttons and sticks out an attack with his B plus C, his being actually longer than hers. Therefore, moving on to Lin. This is hard to tell because Lin is a very difficult character to understand. She does have that sort of dodge animation which has a lot of purposes, and we can definitely see there's probably a lot more that should be done on this character. You could still get used to a few things she does, but I would have to say it's inconclusive because every time I've seen high level or even mid-level Lin play, it's a lot of deep understanding of how to keep your opponent on the defense, even though you're technically not necessarily doing things that are completely safe to do. She's a very frame-trappy character, and that requires a lot of understanding of opponent's tendencies, as well as spacing. Bots of this type of character are generally not created with that in mind. We generally aim to teach you how to stop, like, when they've made a mistake and actually get to punish them. As most other things are like your opponent realizing that they made a mistake, realizing that you punished the mistake, figuring out how to make it look as if they made the mistake again, but didn't. A level of nuance that a bot generally cannot capture too easily. Therefore, she's more likely going to end up similar to our Street Fighter Ibuki bot, where she does a specific set of things really well, but isn't meant to be particularly complicated. That also, however, means that she could maybe end up decent in here with a changed action 3. Give it a shot. Similar to Mika, see what you get, and if it turns out to be useful, then let us know. And finally, Wallstain. The verdict on Wallstain so far is this could have been done so much more easily with even a cursory attempt at a Batista bot. So, once again, the bots share this. He has the long range. If you're not used to the character's range and movement, it might be useful to just throw it out. But again, it's probably better to just try to input Batista. He is, however, much more grounded and therefore able to help you get used to Wallstein's grounded buttons and certain other grab tile things he can do that might surprise you if you've been fighting the other one for too long. So you can consider him more so like random old teacher that you can add into your training when you happen to be doing something else, but probably won't get too much out of if you train against for a long time. Particularly useful is learning where his hurt box is. Since the other form of him often spends a lot of time in the air or far enough away that throwing out big buttons is its main way of dealing with things, this one is actually quote-unquote incompetent enough that you could get to actually move in and test the range on your normals, and often find that his hurt box is quite large. Whether or not you can confirm off these things is a different matter, but you can still learn something. So, with that said, let's go into a point system and maybe some quick switches to demonstrate Outlam and Enkidu, as well as just showing you what it will look like if we did those switches on the others. But for now, we will continue to fight Nanase versus Merkava, and I will give a clear explanation of the point system, then Phonon's point system, then a switch of inputs and some demos. The point system for Merkava is generally to first learn to punish that multi-hit move that he does. This is the easiest point and obviously the one that you lose access to first. As soon as you move up to the quote-unquote medium difficulty, that goes away. This move is not going to be used a lot, but you know, people do sometimes spam moves or drop their combos or whatever, and it's not too hard to punish when he's close, but it is relatively hard to punish when he's further out. Not necessarily because it's too difficult to do overall, but because you can't just mash as easily. And you can't necessarily mash a fast button. It's often a matter of needing to properly time a relatively slower one that will reach. Next in line is actually to shield his running B. This move is very good. This move is really, really good. And it has an equivalent sort of thing that works with a C. Is not a running one, it's a low. Which also really should be shielded. Both of them can be shielded low, so there's no problem there. And his overheads take quite a while, so you are not too likely to get mixed up by it. However, they're not the easiest moves to see coming. In fact, for the sake of this, since we are once again showing off point system, then we are going to move to actually having the health start to fall. Generally, you should be able to check him and poke at him, regardless of any of the inputs going reason. That specifically that running bee, you should be able to shield it and get stuff. Exactly what stuff you get is very, 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 very dependent on your character, and even more importantly, dependent on the range that he did the move from. Often he will want to do that move at max range, and technically your aim here is to learn what it's like when he does it at max range. This move is basically, again, just something you check. You don't necessarily punish it, but attempting something akin to a punish is still the point. This move is only -2. You shield it in order to get as much situation to your advantage as possible and not have to deal with Merkava stuff, more or less. It is one of his best ways of moving forward into that space. It does combo into quite a lot of things if you get hit by it, so you can probably expect quite a few players to do it. Similarly, because it is a move that does not change his height, basically, once he starts into his dash animation, that move just comes next. Not all of the time though, and therefore you're conditioned to block when he might just want to be getting up close to you to do something else. Mainly go into the air very quickly and you would do an instant style overhead or get repositioned for various things. So even though it is not necessarily too hard to do in itself to get the point, it is a high addition to your stress. Realizing it and learning it and getting into the habit of it, therefore, will be enough to let you move on to the hard version, which will basically only be dealing with point system C, the third point system, namely blocking that overhead. Now, not only do you need to block the overhead, you need to be prepared for him to do a lot of weird things after it. Even though, for the most part, if you've input the bot in particular ways, he may not really be able to do much of anything. Sometimes he will fly cancel it. If you shield it, it changes the interaction between yourself and this move enough that you might be able to get some sort of thing, but your general goal is just to block the move. Learning to check it is also helpful, but you really can just give yourself points just for blocking this move. He's not a character that benefits massively from Vorpal, especially if you didn't manage to get the worms, leeches, snakes. If you didn't manage to get those to appear as part of the input consistently, he's not really going to get much off Vorpal at all, because the only thing he really gets in Vorpal is the increase to the damage of his force function. And he can also hit you harder out of it, but again, this is not really something we think about in terms of being important for bots too much. However, when he is forced to block in Vorpal, his leeches, snakes, worms don't disappear, meaning that he can keep you in position. However, the worms themselves are actually things you can hit, which is in fact the next point system. You are only required to get rid of them. Now, this is an interesting point system because it's really easy to do it, but it's not necessarily easy to do it while not getting killed. And that's the primary thing important here. This is particularly true when he uses the EX version and sets out all three, but a lot of the time you will sometimes get this point, luckily he won't do anything, and sometimes you will get the point because you happen to hit him and the worms at the same time. But because he so often avoids lows, not every character can just bully the worms and then expect him to not deal with them for it. We are not in fact giving any points for beating his glide. It's a really easily anti-aired move, the glide itself, and the fly has a lot better options, which is why we made sure he has the glide but did not necessarily focus that much on him using it. Overall, therefore, he's a moderate difficulty bot as a whole. He's not too hard to get away from. He's not too hard to get in on, technically. But depending on things, he can be very tricky because he will get Vorpal and mess you up, and from there push on quite a lot. This is why it's important to make sure that you try to do your best for the timing on that, as the more worms... Yeah, worms good. The more worms he is able to put down, the more often the feeling of, I need to block and keep myself away from this character will come up. And since he really doesn't give you any points for offense, it also helps you to recognize when you are becoming defensive purely because that's quote-unquote what the bot requires. But overall, generally your bigger problem is that once he does hit you, even in the bot form, you often take a lot more damage than you'd expect from a bot, or at least get freaked out enough. Characters with longer reach tend to have much better luck against him, but it also causes them to get clipped in weird situations. This also changes his rhythm and makes your life hard. Merkava benefits quite a lot from having his force function available, as once he does get Vorpal, that tends to do fairly large amounts of damage. Not like supremely large amounts, but enough that you'd notice it. Depending on your input skill, he will also have his long full screen grabs. But it does require somewhat of the change. If you think that that's the move you really need to think about more, if you are a zoner, for example, and you want to try something different, well, we'll get to that in a bit. But moving on to Phonon, to cover Phonon's point system. Phonon's point system is heavily about your awareness of the character. And I mean really heavily about that. The first and the easiest is to punish the 3C. While it would seem that shielding the overhead running thing is a bit easier than that, until you're used to the character, it's actually quite hard to do, primarily because if you don't actually shield, or because of something that happened can't actually shield, if your timing was decent, she gets to hit buttons after this, meaning that your need to stay blocking, in fact, even need to stay blocking standing, can mess you up. Secondarily, as a bot, she generally does a lot of damage, in that you have to constantly defend high-low mix-ups and understand where she is on the screen and what her options are before you can do anything. She is a really easy bot. She's probably going on the very first part of the page, the easiest of bots possible in terms of what you can just get used to. I do not expect her to continue to be a challenge for too long to most people, but she will continue to feel challenging in some situations because when you do get hit, she won't necessarily do a lot of damage, but she often resets herself to a spacing and position where she is at advantage, at least until she just does the random running / dashing B again. Depending on your inputs for her projectiles, you can get quite a few things out of this as well, but mostly keeping up with her isn't that hard. So yes, the first point is actually to deal with that 3C and understand the range at which you can actually do something about it. The move is -14. Most people stand C is their best way of dealing with it if they don't have any other options. And particularly if you have a stand C that can be charged, usually you need to not charge it. Shielding the move also helps a bit. Your second point system is actually also not dealing with the overhead. It is where most of the setup for this conceptual and the feelings regarding how to deal with her come from. You are trying to run and then clip her legs with your own 2B. If your character's 2B is not good, there's usually something similar or some variation on this altogether. The important thing here and the difficulty in this is that, once again, until you have learned to do this without ending up getting your own running B, she is very likely to hurt you for it. This is not necessarily true for Nanase, but Nanase doesn't get that much off it either. So she does want to be able to do this dash up max range 2B. And a lot of the time, you not only want to do this, it doesn't actually have to be your 2B. Your best low is basically the point of this. You want a combo off it. And a lot of the time, this character is ready to go into the air and gets popped up, forcing you to have to hit confirm into something else. She also has a bunch of stuff that lets you do with general movement. Of course, that brings us into the next one, which is in fact actually dealing with the running, i.e. dashing B. Again, shield this move, check her afterwards, punish her if you can. The important thing is stop her and hit it. It's relatively easy to get points for this, and again, this is because the bot isn't really supposed to be hard. The final most difficult point, especially in certain inputs of it, might not even be functional anymore, which is fine because you could get all your points off the third point system anyway, is that when she does her uppercut style attack, the large flash that brings up the wave in front of her, she should be able to do both the A and B versions in at least most of the inputs you are able to see. She does this move extremely rarely, and as a result, it's very useful because you have to learn to react to the fact that it's happened in a very short space of time. This is not her 2-2 move that I'm talking about, which is kind of a leaping downward flash you've been seeing quite often, but rather specifically something I'm sure you will know if you fought enough Phonons to understand what her uppercut looks like. Punish this move. You can whiff punish it, you can block it and punish it, whatever works, but the move is generally going to be so rare that sometimes you will have to question whether or not you even manage the inputs enough to have her even do it. And sometimes the answer will be no, that you didn't. But again, it's not critical, and it doesn't matter that much. So let's make a change. Currently the bot is using the 6B plus C input. And none of the characters we're going to be using really benefit from throws. In fact, they benefit a bit more from assault. So we're going to do 4B plus C, 6D, and then end the recording. This is for action 4. And this will also let us show off how exactly this is done, even though you can't see the controller being pressed, so it doesn't really help you that much. You can see that we changed the X button to that so that we can do this. Phonon is fine for this. In fact, it literally doesn't matter what character you put this on. Your aim should be just to do this quickly. Most force functions will animate in a way that will let you hide the 6D really easily. And you can usually tell how fast you can be. It can be really fast and it'd be fine. Poke at the character to generally verify that they can do their assault. And that's about it. Making sure that they do not jump forward is also not even required. So if you happen to hit up forward, as we see here, it's fine. Almost always has no meaningful effect in any way you care about. But finally, therefore, we will switch back to Mika as we go through some defensive stuff and talk about what that change has done, and look at Eltnum and Enkidu to see what it allows. So we're turning back on all inputs and setting health back to automatically recovering, as this is again mostly just a demo and our final point before the closeout. Most of the functionality will not be changed overly. Most of the time, if you've done it quite right, the character will retain their projectile attack. They will just do somewhat less of it. And in a lot of cases, very little actually changes. Doing it this way, however, basically makes Carmine not work because he will put his dissolves in the wrong position or pull them toward him too much. Which is also why this one is the one that can definitely go with the assault instead, as it doesn't really benefit Carmine much. Phonon's rhythm tends to change a bit. She definitely has some shifts, not all of which are helpful, but mostly she stays about the same and gets maybe some cross-ups and stuff, because she has a 4B in the air and does have some effects that she can get out of this. So if you're having a really good day on your Phonon inputs, this is probably just as useful, if not slightly better. Her damage output seems to go down most of the time, but we haven't done full research on this yet. So feel free to try it out either way, or just switch them randomly according to your feelings. Overall, there's not too much to discuss in this sense when it comes to her. She often gets slightly better combos in the other form. And again, it depends on whether or not you got the 214 inputs, because she often has movement with actual moves that are related to that, similar to how Merkava will have his longer grab, but those things don't affect the point system, which basically means that on any given day, you might just have a different form of it, which is a useful thing at the relatively beginner easy level, because you just have to get used to the idea that sometimes someone you're used to or something you're used to plays differently than usual. A meaningful thing. Overall, it doesn't affect too much else. You'd find that you're much more heavily affected by whether or not you have put in the inputs particularly well that day, than by whether or not she's using 4B plus C or 6B plus C. Therefore, we will show Merkava, but again, it's more of the same for the most part. Depending on your inputs for the day, he may be a little bit more capable of doing specific things, mostly the same long-range grab that we talked about, well, hit grab. But he's not going to overly change most of the time. It does somewhat affect his ability to do cancels out of his force function when he is in Vorpal, but most of the time that happens toward the end and has very, very little effect. If he's put in particularly poorly, and you find that he's not really performing up to par, try to change this input back. He doesn't work well on a bad day with this input, which is basically the same as for Phonon, but whereas with Phonon you can probably play a while without noticing it, with Merkava we suggest that as soon as you feel, I didn't do so well today on this, that you should probably just go change this back to 6B plus C for him fairly quickly. One other minor variation to this sort of thing is that you can go without the B plus C altogether if you're absolutely sure you're only going to use Merkava, and use just C for it if you really want, or sometimes skip it altogether. Using it without the force function at all will make him decent, and he will get some guard thrust reactions and stuff if you really wanted that for some reason. But the other bots don't really function without the force function, and therefore you have to be fairly certain that you're only planning to train with Merkava before it's a decent idea to do that. Therefore, we will show off a bit of the effect this has on Outnum now. She also is mostly affected by whether or not her 214 style move is working, but she also has minor effects from this that are harder to see other than in her rhythm. Her rhythm improves with this version of it, and it's not entirely clear why, other than that obviously she has a different timing for when certain heavy moves are done, and the assault will then follow right after that timing. When she has her low whip grab, it is more functional, but we're showing it off today without that so that you can tell how useful this is to you even when it is not available. Once again, basically on a good day, go for it. But on a good day for your inputs where you want to fight her specifically, generally you want the 4B plus C to lessen certain interactions. She plays a little bit better as a quiet, sort of annoying character, even though it will cause her to do more of her 6B. On a good day, again, she has more options, her rhythm is different, and therefore you see it a little less often. Once the reload is in there, you will get better options overall. The main important shift here is for Enkidu. So we'll demonstrate that and then close out our stream for the night. Mainly you're looking for paying attention to things he does other than his own 6B. because of the spacing of certain combos he does, it becomes easier for him to position himself correctly. Generally, if you want to realize which way this should be done, just consider whether or not the character's command normals matter to you for any given thing you're doing, and that should tell you whether or not the B plus C should be a forward or a backward input. As again, there doesn't tend to be too much of an effect on whether or not it can do any given thing, provided the rest of the inputs are at least decent. In this case, therefore, basically, Enkidu is kind of mashy in certain situations, but he does have a 4C that matters, and it is functionally better than his 6C. His 6C has to be charged to become an overhead. The sort of thing you will see in Enkidu Bot when it's ready, but for now, this is the better way for him to function by a little bit. That spin you see is in fact his force function, meaning that he's probably among the better characters if you find that that move is too easy to deal with or just not that big a deal, to not have involved in that at all. So, quite similarly, you can probably do without it altogether, though it does help his combos, and it really comes down to whether or not any Enkidu player you're interested in fighting or beating has spammed that move a lot in any way to either keep you out, frustrate you, or anti-air you maybe. And you want to learn how to make sure that you punish it properly. Again, no real point system here. No specifics we can give you as to how this is interesting. If he has his 2-1-4 moves, then obviously he's a little bit more dangerous, per se, as he goes into his counter pose more easily. But honestly, whether or not he's good at this is up to you as a player. Obviously, he is one of the ones that has the biggest issue with it not being there. Whereas Phonon can mostly function without it. Merkava can almost certainly function without it, but is really preferable if you play a zoner versus him, because he'll mess you up. Enkidu is kind of the opposite. If you play a character that likes to mash buttons to prevent things, or to check people after certain types of strings or stuff, then him having his 2-1-4 is more important. But once again, on this stream we are showing it off without this input perfectly, because this is meant to be a beginner bot and we want to make it clear how well this can function, even if it does not often do the quarter circle back move for the character. We will therefore be releasing this almost certainly as MerkavaBot, PhononBot, and possibly a separate bot page that is just these inputs and a long explanation of how to use them for other characters and why, so that it can be considered sort of an introductory thing. Whereas the Merkava and Phonon will be much more focused and specific about what you need to get done. This is probably going to be a quick review for anyone who does not have much experience with bots and didn't really feel like trying to input the Wagner one, or just wasn't interested in those characters. This will most likely be the basis for many of the bots upcoming, as the characters that tend to work like this are ones that did not work well with the Wagner bot inputs and don't necessarily specifically have their own outside of the norm style of play. it was fairly easy to start from, oh, these characters can use their 2C well, to move into these characters have really obvious game plans or really specific inputs that need to be accounted for. And now we've just got everyone else. And everyone else is starting to look like we can get something started from here, which will probably be our intent given that these inputs are relatively easy to do and we don't want them to be too complicated just because the characters are. In fact, most of the time the characters are not. And therefore we don't want a bunch of complicated inputs for them. So look out for stuff very similar to these if you find that you are able to make this type of input without too much trouble. You can probably look forward to the upcoming bots being, if not just as easy, at least bearable once you've put this in a couple of times. With all that, therefore, we've come to the end of our Disk Guidance stream for the night. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org, 2-mk.org, UNIST-bots for, obviously, these, DBFZ-bots for those, SF5-bots for the originals, and this is also something you can find with just bots. You should be able to navigate through all of this and use our contact page to let us know if you found anything useful, specifically from this stream, broken, something that you have too much trouble with, or would like to check whether or not there's an easier way to do a particular thing. Just send us an email through the contact, or even poke us on our Twitter at 2_MK_FGC, and probably we'll respond within a day as we use that Twitter every day to let you know what we are streaming for that day, or sometimes that we're not streaming for that day. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.